There are women Hollywood remembers because they were beautiful. There are women Hollywood remembers because they were talented. And then there was Katharine Hepburn, a woman Hollywood never quite managed to control. She did not move like the other actresses of her time. She did not speak like them. She did not dress like them. While the studios tried to package women into soft voices, perfect curls, obedient smiles, and carefully arranged romances, Katharine Hepburn arrived with sharp cheekbones, sharper opinions, trousers instead of gowns, and a stare that made people feel as if she had already judged them before they opened their mouths. To the public, she looked untouchable. She was the woman who did not need approval. The woman who could walk into a room full of powerful men and make them feel small. The woman who refused to play the helpless beauty. The woman who built a career not by bending to Hollywood, but by forcing Hollywood to make room for her. And yet, behind that iron image, behind the fierce independence, behind the voice that could cut through a room like glass, there was a private wound she carried for decades. A love story she did not parade. A man she could not fully have. A relationship that was known by many, whispered about by even more, but rarely spoken of in the way ordinary couples speak of love. Because the love of Katharine Hepburn's life was not simple. It was not clean. It was not the kind of story Hollywood could wrap in a bow and sell as a perfect romance. It was Spencer Tracy. And for more than 2 decades, his name remained tied to hers like a secret everyone knew, but few dared to say too loudly. When people look back at Katharine Hepburn now, they often see the awards, the legendary films, the record-breaking career, the woman who won 4 Academy Awards and became one of the greatest actresses in American cinema. But if you look past the public triumphs, past the red carpets, past the old black and white photographs, you begin to see another story. A story of a woman who seemed too strong to break, but who spent a large part of her life loving a man who could never truly belong to her. That is what makes this story so painful. Katharine Hepburn had already lived a life that seemed designed to resist convention. She came from a progressive family. She was raised to think, to speak, to compete, to challenge. She was not trained to shrink herself for anyone. Even as a young woman, she had the energy of someone who believed the world was not something to fear, but something to push against. She married once, but marriage did not become the center of her life. Her first husband, Ludlow Ogden Smith, belonged to a different chapter, a chapter that ended long before the world began linking her name with Spencer Tracy. Hepburn did not become famous as someone's wife. She became famous as herself. That mattered. In an industry built on controlling women's images, she protected her identity fiercely. Then came the career battles. There were highs, and there were humiliations. She became a star, then was labeled box office poison. Hollywood loved her, rejected her, doubted her, and then watched as she fought her way back with the kind of determination that became part of her legend. She was not merely acting strong on screen. She was surviving in a business that could turn admiration into cruelty overnight. By the early 1940s, Katharine Hepburn had already proven that she could fall, rise, and return sharper than before. But nothing in her career, not the critics, not the studio pressure, not the public judgment, prepared her for the emotional storm that would begin when she met Spencer Tracy. Their first major meeting came through the Film Woman of the Year. On screen, they were electric. The chemistry did not feel forced. It did not look like 2 actors pretending to be fascinated by each other. It looked like a collision. Hepburn's quick, elegant intelligence met Tracy's grounded, masculine stillness, and something about the contrast worked instantly. She was fire. He was weight. She moved fast, spoke fast, challenged everything. He seemed steady, weary, complicated, and deeply human. Together, they created a rhythm audiences could feel even when they did not know what was happening behind the scenes. But behind that screen magic was a reality far more difficult. Spencer Tracy was already married, and he would remain married. That single fact changed everything. It meant their love could not become ordinary. It could not become public in the simple way other relationships become public. There would be no clean announcement, no wedding, no shared domestic life presented proudly to the world. Hepburn was not stepping into a fairy tale. She was stepping into a love that came with shadows from the beginning. And perhaps that is why the story still hurts. Because Katharine Hepburn, the woman who appeared to answer to no one, found herself drawn into the one relationship where strength did not give her control. She could command a film set. She could challenge studio executives. She could rebuild a career after public rejection. But she could not make Spencer Tracy free. And she could not make the world simple enough for their love to exist without consequences. From the outside, people saw two brilliant actors, two legends sharing the screen, two performers whose chemistry became one of Hollywood's most unforgettable partnerships. But inside that connection was something heavier than glamour. There was devotion. There was restraint. There was sacrifice. There was silence. And there was Katharine Hepburn, a woman famous for refusing to hide who she was, suddenly attached to a love that had to remain half-hidden for years. That contradiction would follow her for the rest of her life. The world saw the fearless woman. But Spencer Tracy saw another side. The softer side. The loyal side. The side willing to wait, to protect, to endure, and perhaps even to accept pain if it meant staying close to the man she loved. And that is where the Real story begins. At first, it might have been possible to call it chemistry. That was the safe word. Hollywood used it all the time. Chemistry explained why two actors looked alive together on screen. Chemistry explained why audiences leaned forward when they appeared in the same frame. Chemistry explained why a scene between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy could feel less like acting and more like two strong souls testing each other. But chemistry was not enough to explain what happened between them. Katharine had worked with handsome men before. She had known charm, status, intelligence, and attention. She was not easily impressed. A man could flatter her and be dismissed in seconds. A man could admire her and still never get close. Hepburn did not seem like someone who needed to be chosen. If anything, she looked like the one doing the choosing. Spencer Tracy was different. He was not polished in the same way. He did not have the obvious theatrical elegance of some Hollywood leading men. He carried a heaviness. There was something guarded about him, something restless underneath his calm. He could appear plain beside the glamour of the movie world, but the moment he acted, people understood. He did not perform like he was trying to impress anyone. He seemed to simply exist, and the camera believed him. That was his power, and Katharine felt it. She saw in him a truthfulness that was rare in Hollywood. Around her, many people performed even when the cameras were off. They posed, smiled, exaggerated, invented versions of themselves. Spencer Tracy did not need to do much. He could stand still and make a room feel more serious. He could speak quietly and pull attention toward him. For a woman as sharp and alive as Hepburn, that grounded force must have felt impossible to ignore. On the set of Woman of the Year, their contrast became their language. She was quick. He was still. She challenged. He absorbed. She pushed. He resisted. And somewhere inside that tension, attraction began to form. The cruel part is that from the beginning, there was no innocent road forward. Spencer Tracy was not a free man. His marriage to Louise Tracy had long been complicated, and although he and his wife lived separate emotional lives in many ways, the marriage remained. He was Catholic. Divorce was not something he easily accepted. His family life, his guilt, his faith, his reputation, and his own inner turmoil all formed a wall around him. Katharine could not simply step through that wall, and yet she stayed near it. That is the part of the story that continues to fascinate people. Hepburn had built her identity on independence. She was not the kind of woman people imagined waiting in the background. She was not someone who seemed willing to accept half measures. But with Tracy, the rules changed. She did not demand the public role. She did not force a choice that he was not willing to make. She did not turn their relationship into a spectacle. Instead, she became something quieter, something almost unrecognizable compared to her public image. She became patient, protective, loyal. She adjusted herself around the complicated shape of his life. For some people, this made the relationship hard to understand. How could Katharine Hepburn, of all women, accept a love that could not fully stand in the daylight. How could someone so proud agree to live with so much silence? Was it devotion? Was it sacrifice? Was it weakness? Or was it simply the one place in her life where love overpowered pride? The answer is not easy, and maybe that is why the story still feels human. Because even the strongest people can have one person who changes the rules. For Hepburn, Spencer Tracy seems to have been that person. As their films continued, the public saw a partnership that felt natural, almost effortless. They were not a typical glamorous pair. Their appeal came from intelligence, friction, wit, and emotional weight. When they argued on screen, it felt alive. When they softened toward each other, it felt earned. They gave audiences the thrill of watching two equals collide. But behind the scenes, equality was more complicated. Tracy was admired, but he was also troubled. He struggled privately in ways that made life around him difficult. He could be warm, brilliant, and deeply moving, but also distant, moody, and consumed by burdens he could not easily escape. Hepburn, who could be impatient with almost anyone, seemed to make room for those burdens. She learned when to push and when to step back. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned how to love a man who often seemed at war with himself. That love did not look like the easy romances sold by the studios. It did not have the clean shape of a public Hollywood marriage. It had no simple reward waiting at the end. It was not a story of a woman getting everything she wanted. It was a story of a woman who had everything the world admired, yet still longed for something she could never fully claim. And as the years passed, that longing became part of her legend. Not because she wanted it advertised, but because silence, when it lasts long enough, begins to speak for itself. As the years went on, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy became more than a successful screen pairing. They became a Hollywood mystery. People could feel something between them. It was there in the way they looked at each other. It was there in the pauses. It was there in the arguments that seemed too sharp to be only scripted, and in the tenderness that seemed too quiet to be invented. Audiences did not need gossip columns to tell them something unusual was happening. The screen itself seemed to confess it. But off-screen, there was no official love story. That was the strange cruelty of their bond. They could be together in front of millions, framed by studio lights, protected by dialogue, praised by critics, adored by audiences. But once the cameras stopped, the world around them became complicated again. Spencer Tracy was still Spencer Tracy, the married man. Katharine Hepburn was still Katharine Hepburn, the independent woman who had somehow become tied to a man who could not publicly choose her. Hollywood knew how to sell romance, but it also knew how to hide scandal. In those days, image was everything. Studios protected stars not because they were kind, but because stars were investments. A public affair could damage careers, reputations, and ticket sales. The truth had to be managed. The whispers had to be controlled. The story had to remain soft enough for the public not to turn away. So Hepburn and Tracy lived in a strange space between visibility and secrecy. Everyone could see the connection. No one was supposed to say too much. For Hepburn, this must have been both protection and punishment. She was never a woman who enjoyed being told what to do. She did not like being softened, reshaped, or silenced. And yet this love required silence. It required her to accept a role that was never fully named. She could be his partner in spirit, in loyalty, in work, in private devotion. But she could not be his wife. She could not be the woman standing beside him in the official story of his life. That position would always belong to Louise Tracy. And this is where the story becomes more painful, because Louise was not some faceless obstacle in a melodrama. She was a real woman with her own life, her own dignity, and her own history with Spencer. Tracy's marriage was complicated, but it was not erased. He did not simply walk away from it. Whether because of faith, guilt, family, habit, or emotional conflict, he remained connected to it. That meant Hepburn's love existed beside another woman's sorrow. It was not a clean romance. It was human, messy, and morally uncomfortable. And perhaps that is why Catherine rarely tried to turn it into a grand public declaration while everyone involved was still alive. She understood the cost of words. She understood that some truths, once spoken, do not only free the speaker, they can wound others. So she waited. She worked. She stayed close. Film after film, the partnership grew deeper. Adam's rib showed them as equals sparring with wit and intelligence. Pat and Mike gave audiences another version of their rhythm, playful, physical, and emotionally alive. Their movies did not depend only on beauty or fantasy. They depended on recognition. Viewers watched them and sensed the tension of two adults who understood each other too well. That was the magic. Hepburn and Tracy did not feel like a dream couple. They felt real. And maybe that is because something real was always leaking through. But reality was not always romantic. Tracy carried private struggles, and Hepburn often became his steady presence. She was not merely the glamorous woman beside him. She became caretaker, protector, emotional anchor. The woman who seemed born to be served by Hollywood instead learned to serve someone else's pain. That detail changes the entire meaning of her love. Because for a woman like Katharine Hepburn, devotion was not weakness. It was a choice. She did not need Spencer Tracy for fame. She did not need him for money. She did not need him to make her name important. Her legend was already her own. So when she stayed, it was not because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because something in him held her. And perhaps because something in her believed that loving him, even imperfectly, was worth the cost. To the outside world, Katharine still appeared strong, almost untouchable. She gave interviews with confidence. She kept working. She kept moving. She kept presenting herself as the woman who belonged to no one but herself. But behind closed doors, her life had become emotionally tied to a man who could not give her the simple ending many people expect from love. There was no wedding, no public promise, no final victory over the past. Only years. Years of closeness. Years of restraint. Years of loving someone under conditions that would have broken many people. And then, as time moved forward, the story began heading toward the chapter that would make everything even more heartbreaking. Because the film that would become one of their most memorable works together would also become their goodbye. By the time Guess Who's Coming to Dinner came into their lives, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were no longer just two stars with history. They were two people carrying the weight of years. The world had changed around them. Hollywood had changed. The old studio system was weakening. New voices were rising. New stories were entering American cinema. The polished glamour of the past no longer felt enough. Audiences were beginning to look for something more honest, more direct, more connected to the tensions of real life. And somehow, at that exact moment, Hepburn and Tracy were brought together for a film that would not only become famous, but deeply personal. On the surface, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was about a family forced to confront race, love, fear, and social judgment. It was a story about a young woman bringing home the man she wanted to marry, and her parents being pushed to examine what they truly believed. But beneath that social message, there was another emotional current running through the film. A quieter current, a more painful one. Because for Katharine Hepburn, acting beside Spencer Tracy in that film was not just another professional reunion. It was watching the man she loved grow visibly weaker. It was standing beside him while time was running out. It was performing scenes about love, family, and acceptance while privately facing the possibility that their own long, complicated chapter was nearing its final page. Tracy's health was fragile. Everyone around the production understood there was risk. He was not the vigorous man audiences remembered from earlier decades. Age, illness, and years of strain had left marks on him. His body was tired. His presence was still powerful, but now it carried a shadow. And Hepburn saw it. She could not look away from it. Imagine the emotional cruelty of that situation. For years, she had loved a man she could not fully claim. She had protected him in ways the public did not always see. She had accepted the limits of their relationship, endured the silence, and remained near him through seasons of difficulty. And now, when they came together again on screen, it was not the beginning of another chapter. It felt like the ending. There are performances that become famous because they are technically brilliant. And then there are performances that become unforgettable because the actors are not merely performing. They are carrying real life into the scene. That is what makes Guess Who's Coming to Dinner feel so haunting when viewed through the lens of Hepburn and Tracy's story. Every glance between them seems heavier. Every pause seems longer. Every moment of tenderness feels as if it belongs to two timelines at once: the fictional marriage on screen and the private devotion off-screen that never received the same public dignity. Hepburn played Christina Drayton, a woman of intelligence, warmth, and moral courage. Tracy played Matt Drayton, a father wrestling with fear, principle, and the shock of change. But behind the characters, there was Katharine watching Spencer. There was a woman who had known him for more than 2 decades, now sharing scenes with him while knowing that their time was almost gone. And then came his final speech. In the film, Tracy's character speaks about love, about what it means when two people truly belong to each other despite what the world may think. It is a speech remembered for its emotional force, but for Hepburn, it could not have been just dialogue. As Tracy spoke, the camera found her face, and what appeared there did not feel like acting alone. It felt like memory. It felt like grief arriving early. It felt like a woman listening not only to a character, but to the man who had defined the deepest and most private part of her life. Hepburn's tears in that moment have often been remembered as something more than performance, because how could they not be? She was sitting there, near the end of a long journey, watching Spencer Tracy deliver words about love when their own love had lived for years under restriction, compromise, and silence. The audience saw cinema. Katharine was living farewell. 17 days after filming ended, Spencer Tracy died. And just like that, the man who had been her greatest love was gone. But even in death, the story did not become simple. Hepburn did not suddenly step forward and claim the public role people might have expected. She did not turn his passing into a dramatic announcement of what they had been to each other. She did not attend his funeral. That decision has often been seen as one of the most painful details in their story. Not because she did not love him, but because she understood that there was another woman who had the official place in his life. Louise Tracy was his wife, and Katharine, even after all those years, remained the woman outside the formal frame. That is the tragedy. After decades of devotion, she still had to grieve from a distance. She still had to honor boundaries that had shaped their relationship from the beginning. She had been close enough to love him, close enough to care for him, close enough to share some of the most intimate years of his life, but not close enough to stand publicly as his widow. So the world mourned Spencer Tracy as a screen legend. His family mourned him as husband and father. And Katharine Hepburn, the woman so many believed had loved him more deeply than anyone ever understood, carried her grief in the same way she had carried much of the relationship itself. Privately, proudly, painfully, and in that silence, the legend of their love became even larger. After Spencer Tracy died, Katharine Hepburn entered a kind of silence that said more than any public confession could have said. For years, she had lived with a relationship that could not be fully named. Now the man at the center of it was gone, and still, even in grief, she could not simply step into the open. There was no neat ending. No final public scene where the world officially recognized her as the great love of his life. No moment where the curtain lifted and everyone applauded the truth. Instead, there was absence. And Katharine knew absence better than most. She had spent much of her life being misunderstood by people who thought strength meant a person did not feel deeply. The public saw her as hard, witty, confident, almost severe. They saw the trousers, the proud posture, the voice that never trembled unless she allowed it to. They saw a woman who seemed to have chosen freedom over tenderness. But grief has a way of revealing what pride hides. After Tracy was gone, Hepburn did not collapse in front of the world. That was not her way. She did not become a tragic public widow. She did not build her identity around mourning him. She continued to live, to work, to age, and to remain unmistakably herself. But those who understood the story knew that something in her life had permanently changed. Because Spencer Tracy was not just a man she had loved. He was the man around whom a large part of her emotional life had quietly revolved. For more than 20 years, she had shaped parts of herself around his needs, his moods, his limitations, and his pain. She had accepted a love that required patience. She had stood close enough to see his vulnerability, yet far enough away to preserve the public order of his life. And then suddenly, there was no more waiting, no more careful arrangements, no more private visits, no more shared work that gave them an excuse to be seen together. The secret had ended, but not because it had been freed. It had ended because he was no longer alive. That is one of the cruelest truths of their story. In life, their love was restricted by circumstance. In death, it was restricted by memory. Hepburn could speak of him, but she still had to measure how much. She could honor him, but she could not rewrite the fact that he had been another woman's husband. Even after he was gone, the boundary remained. And perhaps that is why she waited so long before speaking more openly. Katharine Hepburn was not afraid of public opinion in the ordinary sense. She had survived criticism before. She had been mocked, dismissed, labeled difficult, declared finished, and then watched the industry that doubted her turn around and call her a legend. She did not need permission to exist. But the story of Spencer Tracy was not only about her. That made it different. There were other people attached to the truth. There was a wife. There were children. There was a family history. There was pain that did not belong to the public. And for all her boldness, Hepburn seemed to understand that love does not give a person the right to expose every wound. So she guarded the story. For years, she let the whispers remain whispers. Hollywood, of course, continued to speculate. People who knew them had opinions. Biographers tried to interpret the silence. Fans searched old film scenes for hidden meaning. Every glance in Adam's rib, every pause in Woman of the Year, every tender expression in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner became part of the evidence. Their movies turned into emotional documents, not simply entertainment. And slowly, the public image of Katharine Hepburn began to change. She was no longer seen only as the independent woman who belonged to no one. She became something more complicated. A woman who could be proud and self-sacrificing, defiant and loyal, fearless in public, yet painfully private in love. That complexity made her even more fascinating. Because the truth is, Katharine Hepburn did not fit into one simple shape. She was not merely the liberated woman who rejected romance. She was not merely the devoted woman who lived for a man. She was both, and that is what made her real. She could walk through Hollywood like she owned herself completely. And still, one man could occupy the most protected corner of her heart. That contradiction did not weaken her legend. It deepened it. As she aged, Hepburn became more willing to look back. The world around her had changed. The old rules of Hollywood secrecy had faded. The people who once needed protection were disappearing. Time was turning scandal into history and history into myth. Only then did the truth become easier to approach. Not because the pain had vanished, but because enough years had passed for silence to loosen its grip. And when Katharine finally allowed the world to understand what Spencer Tracy had meant to her, it did not feel like gossip. It felt like the last door opening in a life that had been public in fame, but private in love. When Katharine Hepburn finally began speaking more openly about Spencer Tracy, it did not feel like a woman chasing attention. It felt like someone opening a room that had been locked for a very long time. By then, the world had already made its guesses. Fans had watched their films over and over, searching for the moments where performance ended and truth began. Writers had built stories around them. Hollywood insiders had passed down memories, fragments, whispers, and private observations. The public knew enough to suspect that Spencer Tracy had not merely been her co-star. But hearing Katharine herself acknowledge the depth of that bond changed everything. Because for decades, she had protected the story by refusing to make it simple. She did not turn it into a fairy tale. She did not pretend there had been no complications. She did not erase Louise Tracy from the picture. And she did not present herself as a victim begging for sympathy. That was never Hepburn's style. Instead, when she looked back, there was a kind of raw honesty in the way she described what Tracy meant to her. She had loved him. She had cared for him. She had seen the wounded parts of him that the audience never saw. She had stayed close not because the world rewarded her for it, but because her heart had made a choice that her pride could not undo. And that is what made the revelation so powerful. Katharine Hepburn was not a woman who easily admitted need. Her whole public identity had been built on strength. She seemed like someone who could leave any room, any man, any rule, any tradition, and survive without looking back. That was the myth around her. The untamed woman. The independent woman. The woman who belonged to herself. But Spencer Tracy complicated that myth. He proved that even a woman who belonged to herself could still give part of her heart to someone else so completely that the world would spend decades trying to understand it. What made their bond even more haunting was that Hepburn never tried to decorate it with false glamour. She knew Tracy had not been an easy man. He had darkness inside him. He had conflict. He had guilt. He had a life that could not be separated neatly from the people and promises that came before her. Loving him was not like standing under a spotlight. It was more like standing in a hallway outside a closed door, waiting, listening, knowing that some rooms would never fully open. And still, she stayed. That decision is either heartbreaking or extraordinary, depending on how you look at it. Perhaps it was both. Some people have judged her for it. Others have romanticized it. But the truth sits somewhere more uncomfortable. Katharine Hepburn was not a naive young woman trapped in a fantasy. She was intelligent, strong-willed, famous, and experienced. She understood what she was doing. She understood the limits. She understood the pain. And that may be the saddest part. She did not love Spencer Tracy because she believed the story would become easy. She loved him while knowing it probably never would. That is a very different kind of love from the kind Hollywood usually sells. It is not the love of grand weddings and public promises. It is the love of staying nearby when there is no prize for staying. It is the love of accepting emotional weight without applause. It is the love of choosing someone again and again, even when that choice leaves you with less than you deserve. For Katharine, Spencer was not just a romantic memory. He was a defining presence. A man whose shadow stretched across her career, her private life, and her later reflections. She had other relationships. She had other admirers. She had moments of independence that were entirely her own. But when people asked who truly lived at the center of her heart, the answers seemed to circle back to Tracy. That did not mean her life was empty without him. Katharine Hepburn was too vast a person to be reduced to any man. She had her own genius, her own victories, her own battles, her own legend. She was not great because Spencer Tracy loved her. She was great before him, beside him, and after him. But love does not care about balance sheets. It does not ask whether a person is already famous enough, strong enough, complete enough. It enters where it enters. And in Hepburn's life, it entered through Spencer Tracy and stayed there, quietly, painfully, stubbornly. In her later years, when she became more reflective, the public finally saw a softer version of the woman they thought they knew. Not weak, not broken, just honest. A woman who had carried a private devotion through decades of fame and judgment. And that is why the story still pulls people in. Because behind the legend of Katharine Hepburn was not just a star. There was a woman who loved one man so deeply that even after his death, even after years of silence, even after the world had changed, his name still seemed to hold the most fragile part of her truth. But the question that haunted Katharine Hepburn's story was never simply whether she loved Spencer Tracy. The real question was what that love cost her. Because from the outside, it is easy to romanticize a hidden love. It is easy to turn silence into poetry, sacrifice into nobility, and longing into something beautiful. But for the person living inside it, the truth is heavier. A love that cannot fully step into the light does not only create mystery, it creates loneliness. And Katharine Hepburn, for all her fame, knew that loneliness. She could be surrounded by crews, directors, reporters, admirers, and friends, yet still carry the private knowledge that the person who mattered most could not fully stand beside her. She could receive praise from the world, win awards, dominate conversations, and still return to a part of her life that had no official name. That is the part many people forget. Fame does not protect the heart. Success does not cure waiting. And independence does not always stop a person from loving someone who can only give them part of himself. Katharine had built a life that looked free, but love placed her inside a kind of emotional restraint. She did not belong to Spencer in the public way a wife might. Yet she was not free from him either. He occupied the space between devotion and impossibility, between presence and absence, between what was real and what could never be officially acknowledged. For more than 20 years, that space became part of her life. She learned to live with contradictions. She was a feminist figure before the world comfortably used the language. She dressed as she wanted. She spoke as she wanted. She chose work, privacy, and self-possession over the expected path of womanhood in her era. But in love, she accepted terms that seemed almost opposite to the image she projected. And that contradiction made people uncomfortable. Some wanted to believe she was too strong to suffer. Some wanted to believe she had complete control. Some wanted to believe that if a woman like Katharine Hepburn stayed, then the arrangement must not have hurt her. But strength does not mean pain disappears. Sometimes strength means enduring pain without letting the world turn it into spectacle. Hepburn's loyalty to Tracy was not loud. It did not demand pity. It did not ask the audience to clap. It lived quietly, almost stubbornly through the years. And perhaps that was why people who knew the story could never fully let it go. It was not because it was scandalous. Hollywood had plenty of scandals. It was because it revealed something unexpectedly tender inside a woman people had mistaken for untouchable. She could be severe. She could be funny. She could be difficult. She could be brilliant. But she could also love with a depth that made her willing to carry a private burden most people would never have accepted. And still, the love was not perfect. It would be dishonest to describe it as pure happiness. There were shadows. There were limits. There was another family. There were years of emotional complication. There were questions that could never be answered cleanly. What did Hepburn give up? What did she receive? Was the closeness enough? Did she ever resent the role she had to play? Did she ever feel the bitterness of loving someone so deeply and still having to stand outside the official story? We cannot know every answer. But the power of the story is that we can feel the questions. In her later years, Katharine did not present herself as a broken woman. She never seemed interested in begging the world to understand her choices. If anything, she looked back with the same sharpness that had always defined her. She knew people would judge. She knew they would simplify. She knew some would call it tragic, while others would call it romantic. But maybe to her, it was simply life. Messy, unfair, tender, unfinished. Spencer Tracy had been gone for years, but his presence remained in the way people spoke about her. Whenever her name appeared, his was never far behind. Their films became monuments, but also clues. Their shared scenes preserved something that private life could not openly preserve. On screen, they could look at each other. On screen, they could argue, laugh, soften, and reconcile. On screen, audiences could witness the kind of connection that real life had forced into shadows. That may be why their movies still feel alive. They do not only show two great actors. They show two people carrying a secret emotional history through every line, every glance, every silence. And by the time Katharine Hepburn reached the final chapters of her life, the world understood something it had only whispered before. The strongest woman in old Hollywood had not escaped heartbreak. She had simply carried it with extraordinary dignity.